My arrest has nothing to do with me. My arrest is about the violation of press freedoms in Canada and the fact that there is a trend in Canada where journalists are being arrested. I was detained and arrested by SPVM police officers despite identifying myself as a journalist numerous times. On Monday, April 15th, I was arrested by the SPVM while covering a pro-Palestinian demonstration in downtown Montreal. Essentially, the blockade was held at this Scotiabank because Scotiabank invests a lot of money in Elbit Systems Limited. Elbit Systems is an Israeli defense contractor, and essentially what activists were doing were blockading the ATMs and blockading the teller booths, essentially to draw attention to Scotiabank's investment in Elbit Systems.
You know, what I thought was interesting in Savanna's case was how they kind of drew a caricature, if you will, a mental caricature of what a journalist should look like. And they said that she didn't fit that mold or that typography. I just don't understand, that she didn't have a Kevlar jacket on or something that says press, as if she was in the middle of Bakhmut in Ukraine. It just boggles the mind, and I feel like that, in a lot of ways, is so indicative of the ignorance and the lack of understanding and literacy towards, where we need to get. Journalists have constitutional protections to be present and to report on matters that are happening in the public interest. So I'm extremely disappointed and alarmed. Surprised, I wouldn't quite use that. I would say more disappointed and frustrated as well.
A lot of these recent arrests have been around protests identifying ongoing colonialism, both in our own country and how Canada is contributing to ongoing colonialism in other nations as well. And journalists should not feel intimidated. Journalists have a right to be there, and these events should be documented. The public should understand what's going on. And when journalists are arrested, and journalists that do have to fight for their rights and fight for their press freedoms in court, this takes away from them doing their job.
That the police are in a way, it seems, they're being reactionary and trying to silence journalists, but they're also being proactive, I think, in protecting their own interests, because when people see the kind of police violence that happens against people who are protecting their rights, police forces lose popular support and public support. And of course, they need that support in order for politicians at various levels of government to come through for funding, to keep giving police forces more and more money.
It serves exactly the purposes of the authorities, and in that way, it's kind of a perfect crime. And if you want to think about it, because you're able to silence or remove any dissenting voices, anybody who would, who is there to try and document what's going on or see tactics being employed. A lot of times these are related to protests. There was in Fairy Creek in BC when this happened. When I think of Brandy Morin's case in Edmonton, it was related to an encampment and cleaning out of an encampment for unhoused people. This is kind of the common thread in a lot of these cases. And so what do is the police come in, feign ignorance, I suppose, about what the role of a journalist is supposed to be in these kind of situations, and say, well, either put them under arrest, like they did with Brandy, or detain them, like they did with some other, photographer like Ian Wilms in Toronto when he was covering the encampment displacement. And, they put you in the back of a police cruiser and drive you around for a little while and drop you off at the other side of town. And they say, okay, you're free to go.
And over the last 7 months, I have spent a lot of time covering pro-Palestinian activism in Montreal, essentially trying to make the public aware of what's going on. And there have been many events that I've gone to where I am one of the few journalists there. There hasn't been a very strong presence of journalists at these events since October. So my intention going to these events is to shed light on what's going on. And, you know, as my employer has this mandate to cover grassroots movements, this is what I'm doing. I'm doing my job. I'm following the mandate of my workplace. Journalists should be out in the world interviewing people and identifying what's going on in our society. The public has a right to know, and you know, such as Justin, such as Michael Toledano or Amber Bracken, and many, many more. You know, they were taken away from doing their job, not just at the time of when they were arrested, but also, you know, dealing with the implications of potential charges, or in Justin's case, he spent a lot of time in the courtrooms, and that took him away from doing his job, which is so vital and is one of the pillars of democracy in our society.
I had to leave, so that was the immediate impact. Was it took I was the only reporter who followed the story onto the site. So removing me removed any eyewitness account, any journalists from the site, and was able to impact the story that way. And people felt very vulnerable once I left, because they've seen what police do to Indigenous people who defend their lands and their rights. You know, in my case in 2016 and 2017, I wasn't handcuffed and put in jail like other journalists have been since that time. But I was put through a lengthy court process, which took a lot of valuable time and resources away from the journalism that we were able to do. So regardless of whether or not you're physically arrested, just the fact that you're charged and have to deal with that is a big consequence of police trying to interfere with journalism in Canada.
Many of the journalists who have been arrested in Canada over the last recent years have been working at small publications. You know, Amber Bracken, who was arrested in 2021, she was working with the Narwhal at the time, and Justin Brake was working with the Independent at the time. These are not massive media outlets. They are smaller publications, and you know, whether a journalist is working with the CBC or they're working with the Narwhal, whoever it is, they should still be recognized that, you know, they have the freedom of expression, and as journalists, they should be allowed to attend these events without the fear of being arrested.
I've made offers to the RCMP in the past about putting together, you know, a one-pager on, you know, the legal cases, the Brake case, what happened with Amber, what's happened with, you know, work in Indigenous communities with like Carl Dockstader and others, you know, and that's kind of completely fallen on deaf ears. So, you know, there should be a simple thing in there saying, if there's a journalist and they are A, not protesting, B, you know, have a press pass, C, you know, like very, very straightforward things. But it just seems there's this immovable block where it just doesn't seem like something that's interested. So I'm going to keep pushing for this because I think it's useful, but it takes somebody on the other end willing to be able to do that, and I haven't seen that level of interest or that level of willingness. And it really emphasizes the important action that organizations like the CAJ and others need to take in order to make sure that becomes something on the agenda of, you know, the Association of Chiefs of Police or whomever, to make sure that becomes rectified and we don't keep tripping over the same wire over and over again.
And I hope that, you know, if we get another court decision in any of these cases, that we get a strengthening of journalists' rights and press freedom rights. And by the way, journalists' rights and press freedom rights are not just for journalists. These are rights guaranteed to all Canadians, that Canadians can have press freedom, that they can have a free press. And if we're not allowed to document how police officers do their work and how police enforcement goes down on the ground, that is extremely anti-democratic and very unconstitutional, in my opinion.